Come join Mellisa and her guests on the Chats from the Blog Cabin podcast. From North Carolina, this podcast will have you feeling like you've known these folks for years. Listen in as they chat about life, culture, current events, and more, all with a special Southern flair. Curl up with your favorite beverage and get ready to be entertained. Tune in now for a unique experience that's fun and insightful.
Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of Chats from the Blog Cabin. You know, the show where I virtually invite people into the blog cabin to chat about life. And today is a very, I want to say a heavy topic, but I hope it's an informative topic for you. It's about mental health. It's something that most people have a taboo, a stigma about. But I think it's important that we talk about mental health and we talk about what people can do to help their mental health. So Phyllis is joining us today. And Phyllis, before we get into talking about mental health, tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I am a psychotherapist and an author. I've been a psychotherapist for over 30 years, and I have a lot of experience working with, a whole range of people, families, couples, children, individual adults, and even groups. And I, over the years, have just had a lot of experience with the level of dysfunction in families that you wouldn't necessarily imagine is happening sort of behind closed doors, because we all, many people manage to function pretty well in their external life. So I began to equate some of what I was seeing in individual families with what goes on that's not functional in larger groups, all the way up to the functioning of our largest institutions and businesses and government. And so I wrote this book, America in Therapy, to try to bring some of what I've learned, and I know I'm not alone in this, out from sort of the office doors of a psychotherapy office and into the world, and make a lot of what I think could be really helpful in healing our human relations much more common knowledge.
Yeah, human relations, that's a big word that encompasses a lot. I mean, mental health, a lot of our mental health comes from our relationships with others, because what we may perceive as one little slight can just tear us down and be carried with us for years, correct?
Absolutely, 100%. For me, human relations is the big missing piece in what we actually focus on and invest in terms of peace and security and provision for ourselves and our own mental well-being, mental health on the largest scale as well as the smallest scale. Because you're absolutely right. As a therapist for so many years, working with so many people with, everyone has a different story, but invariably the pain that people bring to therapy, the thing that they want most healed, is their relations with other people and themselves that have been injured by deleterious, dysfunctional, and sometimes violent and abusive relationships in family and in community, and sometimes in the larger world. So 100% I agree with you.
So why do you think it's hard for people to admit they're flawed and to admit they need help and to admit they need to go into therapy?
It's a great question, because I have run into it a lot over the years where people, will sort of, what drives people to therapy is pain. It's sort of like going to a doctor. You don't go to the doctor unless something's really hurting or not working in your body. And it's the same with our relationships and our mental health and emotional well-being, that it's usually a certain level of extreme discomfort, pain, and blockage that brings people to therapy in the first place. But so many people have come in and said, I'm afraid to be needy. And I think we have for one thing, and I do think there's many answers to your question, but one thing I'll say to begin with is, I think we have kind of a myth in America anyway, of being like the self-made man, being independent. I don't really need anything. I can do it all. And while that is a beautiful thing to strive for in terms of creating, strong adulthood and appropriate independence, sometimes it blocks out that we really do need each other. We actually really do. Science has even shown that we are wired to bond and connect with other human beings. And when that need isn't met, we are left with a gaping hole of need when that need isn't met healthfully. We have a gaping hole of need that we've somehow been taught to feel shame about, instead of that it really takes courage to ask for help. It takes courage to say, I don't know what to do. Can you help me? Just like we wouldn't think that if we went to a doctor and said, I have a pain in my right side. Can you help me? I don't think we would feel shame about that in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
That totally makes sense. So how do we get over that feeling of shame? Because I've heard it said several times, and it's like this message keeps coming back to me, like this week alone, that it's stronger to ask for help when you need help than it is. People must view it as a weakness. So how do we get over that stigma that it's a
Absolutely.
weakness and that we need help and we should ask for it when we need it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things, and I think the big one, I'll sort of start with the big and then move maybe into the smaller picture, but the big one is that I think we're in trouble as a country. I think we have to be able to ask for help. The escalation in mass murders and racial discrimination and the poverty level, the gap between the rich and the poor, there are so many things that are saying we need help. There's people here, masses of people, not just a few people, but masses of people are suffering. And suffering people, when they don't get attention, healthy attention, caring attention, when they don't get heard, when they get shamed more, tend to act out or act in. So if that makes sense. So, it's like a child. If a child is screaming in pain because they cut their knee and nobody comes to help them, the anger and the fear and the pain inside is probably going to cause them to either self-harm or become outwardly in some way harmful to others, or in some way dysfunctional, because our pain has to go somewhere. So I think we have to look at the big picture of what's impacting a lot of people, and as a country even say, we need help. We need help. There are things, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, because in the world of psychology, we know a lot of what helps. We know how to answer some of the cries for help that mitigate, the rippling effects of unaddressed abuse or neglect or discrimination. We know how to do that in our psychotherapy offices, and I want to bring that to the world. And part of that is exactly what you said, is creating new role models for being vulnerable. And there's a lot out there about that that could be expanded on, but it's already in the conversation. I don't know if you've ever heard of Brene Brown, but she's a very, very famous person who talks about the power of vulnerability. So it's in the conversation. We have celebrities who have come out and said they had to go into treatment and that it really changed their lives. So it's a growing conversation that we need to grow, that actually being vulnerable enough to even feel the shame, if you have to feel it, and get help, brings healing. And then we have more and more people who can testify to the power of that and normalize it rather than make it something, that's sort of like weak or something you should hide.
Do you think that's because the younger generation, I have daughters that are, one will be 28, one's 25, and one's 21, and that they're more apt to go get therapy? Do you think that's the turn for the younger generations are more vulnerable about the way they're talking, and they're actually teaching their parents how to be more vulnerable as well?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I would think that it's way more the case than when I was young. Because when I was young, no one talked about vulnerability. No one talked about psychology. No one talked about therapy. And it was definitely shameful to admit that you were in pain or lonely or scared or felt like you didn't fit in. It was very, very shameful to admit any of that. And so we didn't. Everybody just tried to really look good. So I think you're right. I think there's definitely a growing sense in younger populations that we need to have our vulnerability and normalize it and make it something actually that brings us together, because that's one of the major points, that if we can share our vulnerability as well as our successes and our gifts and our strengths, if we can share our vulnerability, it's more likely that we're going to feel connected to other human beings and not defended, because we don't have to defend our identity. We don't have to look good all the time.
Well, I love that. Defending our identity. That's something that I think a lot of people feel like they have to do all the time.
I think they do. And I think there's still a lot of pressure in our culture to do that. I do think that. So I think what you're talking about is growing, but I think it needs to grow a whole lot more. For many reasons. At the top, of the tip of the iceberg that really shows is, to the extent that we can't be vulnerable, which means not only that I could share my pain, or I could share my fears, or I could share the places where I feel like I've failed, but I could also share the places where maybe I haven't been so great to other people. Mm-hmm. That's another form of vulnerability. We've all messed up in our human relations, as well as have had people hurt us. And part of vulnerability is to say, that wasn't so great the way I talked to you. I'm really sorry. How can I make it up to you? Or can you forgive me? Or commit to doing it differently in the future. And everything that I'm saying here, I want to see us take on as a nation. I want to see us take on that level of vulnerability and personal responsibility as a country, both for the problems we've faced and the problems we've created. Because
I love what you just said about, admitting when you messed up, because most people don't want to admit when they've made a mistake, and they don't want to admit when they messed up, or don't want to even go and say, I'm sorry to people. They want to hold that grudge, even though they know they're part of the person with the grudge. That is huge.
That it is huge. And it is such a huge national issue, because if we can't do that, then what we do is continue to blame our victims, which is what you just said. We continue to blame others rather than take responsibility for ourselves. And I think on a widespread level, the danger of that, which we already see, it's not something that could happen, it is happening, that we blame the poor, we blame minorities, we blame people who are of a different race or color or religion as a way not to take responsibility for our part. How are we as a country taking care of everyone? If someone is really poor and they have no opportunity for advancement and they can't make a living wage, and they're looked at sideways every time they go into a store because of the color of their skin or the religious garb they're wearing or whatever it is, how long do you think it's going to be before they explode or implode? How are they going to thrive when there's nothing feeding them good food in the human environment that we all expect everybody to just survive in?
Good food of a human environment. I absolutely love that. I'm writing that down now as we speak, because I had never even thought about it that way.
Yeah. One of the things I just say outright in my book is love is the best food for human beings. And it is. And hatred and discrimination and alienation and violence and assault are the worst food for human beings. So if we're feeding other human beings terrible food, how can we expect them to thrive? How can we expect them to become safe for everyone? We can't.
I love that. We need to take a brief commercial break, but we'll be right back to talk about your book.
Thank you.
People welcomed me, and they knew the pain of the journey that we'd been on because they'd been there too.
Other Parents Like Me is an online community, peer-led, for parents with kids struggling with mental health and or substances.
It's a space that's safe. It feels like I can actually share what's going on.
We offer 15 daily support groups per week and live speaker talks on Thursdays, as well as a monthly expert panel.
We also have a resource hub that has a toolkit This includes over 1,000 articles, podcasts. There's a glossary with the most recent and relevant terms. And we have a directory that's been vetted.
The overwhelming feeling when we're sitting in a meeting and I'm telling my story and I see others shaking their head, tears falling, they understand this roller coaster and they're along for the ride.
And we are back chatting with Phyllis. Before we went to break, you were talking about the good food for the human environment. Now, I do have one question to follow up. Why is the cost of therapy? Because a lot of people that you were talking about that were, these poor people, they're not given these. Why isn't therapy more available to people like that? Why isn't it across the board? Because honestly, I think that should be something that should be integrated across everything.
I absolutely agree with you. And one of the many, many points that I make in my book is that we invest in everything else. We have a huge defense budget. We invest in all kinds of, of anything technological, for instance. We put man hours and billions of dollars into our phones and our computers and our cars and our transportation systems and all of that. There's nothing wrong with any of that. We live in a world where we depend on those things, but the one thing that really doesn't get invested in is human relations. And that's what therapy is about. Therapy is about healing the wounds to ourselves that create the most dysfunctional and violent and sometimes, abusive and violent human relations. And in our personal lives, we know this. And yes, I totally agree. I think that psychological therapy and counseling and mediation and any kind of work that brings people back together and heals the wounds between them and the ruptures between them should have a massive amount of federal funding and state funding. We have the tax dollars. It's a question of the allocation and maybe not yet understanding the necessity for it. So many other things come first, as we know. So for me, yes, I totally agree with you. There's years of training involved in becoming a therapist. It is a profession. Should it be affordable for everyone? Should it be covered for everyone? Absolutely. But in addition, I just want to say part of the message of my book is let's take it out of the psychologist or the psychotherapist's office and into the world. We can all learn better ways of relating to one another so that people don't need therapy. You know what I mean?
So you basically put yourself out of a job.
You know what? And that's actually what a doctor does. A doctor is supposed to bring your body back to health and put himself or herself out of a job. And it's absolutely the same for a therapist. We're supposed to put ourselves out of a job.
So you wrote this book, American Therapy, but before we get into the particulars of the book, what made you decide to go and be a therapist? Did you have like an aha moment, or was it just something that you kind of just fell into?
Yeah, well, it was sort of both. I mean, it didn't fall into it, but it might not have been a moment, but I had a lot of trauma in my own childhood that I really didn't, as I said, no one talked about therapy or psychology then. I went to see a therapist actually once when I was in college at a friend's recommendation, and I felt so much shame about talking about how my life wasn't working that I never went back. And then I got married and I had 3 children and my life was kind of falling apart. And that was in the very early 80s. And at that time, people were starting to talk about psychotherapy. And I decided to give it a shot, and it changed my life. It really changed my life. I began to make sense of myself in a way that I could never understand, my thoughts, my feelings, my, not so good choices, my reaction patterns. And it was a long journey, as it is for many people when there's wounds in our childhood, but it's worth every bit of the effort. So yeah, that was what. So at that point, my kids were little. My youngest was a baby, and I decided to go back to graduate school. And at that point, I went to graduate school in psychology and counseling.
Well, I can't even imagine. A lot of people, when they get to this point where they have a family, you see it more now, people going back to school and changing careers like mid-career or doing things. But I applaud you for realizing that, hey, this is something that's broken in me that I need to work on, but I also want to help others find what's broken in them and work on as well.
Yeah, and I think that's, sometimes people's professions really are a calling that comes out of their own experience in some way. It might not be trauma, but I also think that, there's an expression, healer, heal thyself, or something like that. And I think that when you've been through a process of healing, and I would say, I think it's a lifelong journey. I don't think you come to the end like I'm healed now, but I think it's a lifelong journey. But as you go through that process, your understanding becomes so deep. I felt like my understanding became so deep about the suffering that people can experience at the hands of other people that it gave me a level of compassion and patience that I might not have otherwise had. Because, we're kind of like a quick fix society, take a pill, do a short-term therapy thing and be well. And sometimes it's not like that.
That's so true. So now let's get into your book, America in Therapy. Tell us the premise about it and the reason why you decided you wanted to write it.
Yeah, so what happened out of my own experience, being a client and then becoming a therapist and working with, hundreds of people over the years, I began to see that the patterns that I was looking at in dysfunctional families were the same patterns that I see playing out in larger organizations, in communities, in states, and in the larger, some of the larger branches of government and with some of the leaders of government, that there was a direct correlation between some of the most abusive family dynamics and some of the worst things that larger organizations and people in power are able to perpetrate and do perpetrate on millions or thousands and millions of people. And I wanted to write about that correlation, not so much because to blame anyone, because one of the things I want to say is that psychotherapy and psychology are not partisan. They're not red and they're not blue. Mm-hmm. They're for our best survival. The purpose of psychology is to help people survive best in their human relations, to care for one another, to have good boundaries, to have ways to settle conflict peacefully and without violence, to feel valued and a sense of belonging. And the list goes on. These are the things that we all want in our own lives. And when I looked around the country and some of the policies we make, it became so glaringly clear to me that we legislate things toward other people that we would never want done to ourselves. Mm-hmm. Talk about putting immigrant children in cages. Who would ever want their child to be treated that way or allow it and not feel outraged and rebel? And yet we allow things to be done to other people that we would consider criminal if they were done to us. And again, not to say that from a place of blame, but to say that gap between what we know is healthy, what we know is good, what we know is right, and what we allow to be done to other people is a sign of ill mental health. It's not a political issue. It's a mental health issue. Mentally healthy people don't put children in cages, for an example. So I really wanted to bring my awareness of abuse family dynamics into the general conversation so that we can understand what's happening. Again, not ultimately for the point of blaming anyone, but for the point of using the tools that we know from good psychology and psychotherapy that can help break the cycle of abuse, interrupt the patterns of violence, bring people back to a healthy, loving sense of themselves and others, and create a more peaceful and loving world, because I really think we're in danger. I think we're in great danger from the escalation of violence. So that's the point of the book. The point of the book is to sort of, kind of like a doctor, to say, this is what's causing your liver to be inflamed. And this is what would heal your liver or give you the best possibility of healing your liver. And these are the things that will destroy your liver. But the purpose is the healing. So, but you have to say, like, if the person is an alcoholic and their liver is being destroyed, you have to say, alcohol is not serving you. Alcohol is killing you. And I think on a psychological level, my goal is to say the same things. These are the things that are killing our humanity. These are the things that are putting our children at risk. These are the things that are destroying our sense of belonging and well-being in the world. And this is what we can do to reverse courses.
Wow. I mean, you just laid a lot right there, because honestly, the children in cages, that's just like you said, just one problem that our country has. Why do you think it's okay for people just to say, well, not okay. It's not okay. Let me put it that way. It's not okay. But most people are like, oh, well, I'll just let it go. It doesn't affect me, because they're not taking it on personally, or what? I mean, it just boggles my mind.
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I do think it has many answers. But two that come to my mind are the one that you said. I think we have sort of been trained to think if it doesn't affect me, it's none of my business, and I don't have to care. It's somebody else's problem. That's part of it, and I think that's part of the numbing out that we're being subjected to our own humanity. I also think that there's more at play than that, but I think that's an important factor. But one really big important factor is that one of the attributes of an abusive family or an abusive person, let's say, is an abusive person targets someone. You can't abuse someone if you don't have more power than they are, because they can resist you, they can fight you, or they can get away. So an abuser can only be abusive if they have power over other people. And so abusers look for people who are less powerful to target, to have their power and control, or to exploit, or to sexually exploit, or physically violate out of their own rage, or whatever reasons underlie their need to harm other people. So what you have in the larger picture of society is you have people that have, and institutions that have so much power that in order to keep that power, somebody has to be less powerful. And those become their targets. And they often convince other people to believe that those they have targeted are inferior, are less worthy, are somehow less human, deserve what they're getting because they're lazy, or they're from another country, or from whatever reason they give. But abusers always justify the abuse by attributing something negative to the people they harm. And they rope other people into believing the same things. And so it's very easy for many other people to sit by and think, well, if those people had tried harder, they wouldn't be in the situation they're in, and they're not my problem. So that's one thing. Is it too much if I say one more thing?
Go right ahead. I'm really enjoying listening to you.
Thank you. I don't want to be overwhelming, but one of the things that I share a lot I share a lot about this in my book, and I share a lot about this when I'm talking about my book, is that abuse and neglect become intergenerational. They become cyclical. If the pattern is not interrupted, it repeats, like any pattern, right? And so as over the years, working with so many people, and I do want to just sort of throw this in, the level of abuse and neglect in our country is very, very high, even among people who appear to be functioning well. The kinds of stories that I've heard over the years from people that just seem like you and me are sometimes extraordinarily terrifying, of what they have suffered and survived and somehow managed to come out of it and still function in some way in the world. But the pain they carry is enormous. And so I've worked with a tremendous amount of abuse and neglect over the years, not even advertising that that's what I'm doing. That's just what people bring through the door. And so what I see as a general pattern, and this does not apply to everyone for sure, because there's no pattern that applies to everyone, But what I see as a general pattern, if abuse and neglect are not stopped, and if people do not have the opportunity or denied the opportunity to get help, there's two main outcomes for people. And one is called learned helplessness. We just learned to be helpless because we were helpless. The abuser had the power. They could beat you up. They could assault you sexually. They could deprive you of food. They could do whatever they wanted because they had the power. And so you learn to be helpless in the face of that because you actually don't have any power. And people often, it doesn't end when they leave home. They carry that sense of learned helplessness out into the world, and they become helpless in the face of other kinds of injustice. And this is another level of the answer to your question, that many people just feel helpless. They feel powerless. There's nothing I can do. It's too big of an issue. What am I going to do about the Supreme Court? What am I going to do about the Black man that was murdered in front of everybody in another state? What can I do? I'm powerless. And it just sort of stays there. And people who have learned to be powerless can be overpowered then again in their adult life by partners, by employers, and by people in positions of higher authority. And they're often conscripted into being a support for people who are assaultive or abusive or overly aggressive or in some other way harmful to other human beings because they don't have the power to say no. The other piece of the pattern, and they often are attracted to partners who are domineering and sometimes abusive. The other side of the pattern is those who, what we call in psychological language, identify with the abuser, and they'll do anything in the world not to be submissive or helpless, and they become aggressive, and they identify with people who are aggressive. They become the bullies on the playground or the kids who support the bully on the playground. And if that pattern is not interrupted and then they become an employer, they can become a very hard person to work with. And if they run for office, they might be somebody who legislates putting children in cages. And I don't want this to be an oversimplification. There's many, many factors that go into all of these configurations of human behavior. But these two patterns are very dangerous for society. If more and more people become helpless and more people become aggressive, and there's nothing to interrupt that cycle, then we're in trouble because we're going to have an easily dominated culture that is dominated by people who are not mentally well. And the way to interrupt that pattern is to get help, is to have some people who stand outside that dynamic, who can offer help, who can offer healing, who can create limits and boundaries on people who are highly aggressive or exploitive in a way that is not violent and seeks to heal them. Because inside every perpetrator is a victim. That's my belief. And it might not be 100% true, but in general, I believe that is the truth. And so we have to focus on healing and not just overt punishment, blame, and retribution. Anyway, I know I've said a huge amount there, so I'm going to stop and let you chime in.
All right. Yes, you have said a huge amount, but what you're saying makes sense, especially when you talk about the intergenerational things that go passed down from generation to generation. And I'm just going to share a story. I was brought up with, you didn't talk about anything. If you had your feelings, you buried them down. You didn't talk about them. That was the way my mom was brought up. So that was the way I was brought up. But I decided, I made a conscious effort. And I think that's what we need to do as a society, make a conscious effort.
Right.
That when I had my girls, that they're going to be able to come and talk to me about stuff, regardless of, without them feeling like they're going to be judged, without them feeling like they've done something wrong. Of course, I might get upset about it, but I still wanted them to have that, be vulnerable and be comfortable enough to come to me and talk to me about that.
Beautiful.
And that just made the difference in the dynamics that I have with my girls as opposed to the dynamic that my mom had with me, because I don't feel that unconditional love with my mom. But with my girls, they feel that from me.
Yeah. And that's perfect. That's part of what I think the evolution of our consciousness in terms of healthy psychology is bringing us to where things are out in the open to be worked on. It doesn't mean we're not going to have human reactions of anger or fear or sadness or pain or feeling left out or whatever we feel. But we're opening the arena of human relations to actually work those feelings out. We're always going to have conflict, but we don't have to have armed conflict. We can have nonviolent conflict resolution if we choose it. And the quickest access, the best access to nonviolent conflict resolution is exactly what you're talking about, that we're safe to talk about, what's vulnerable, that we have someone we can turn to, that we're not alone, that we're not shamed, that we're not blamed, that we're not targeted. Yeah, beautiful.
And I've even had the conversations with them saying that I hope that the mistakes that their dad and I made with them, that they would learn from their mistakes and they could learn from it so they wouldn't pass those mistakes down to their children. I mean, I was even admit to say, and most parents don't say, I've made a mistake. Most parents, oh, my kids are perfect. But I'm like, no, I know as a human, I've made mistakes. Is the way I was brought up.
And that's actually what we were talking about earlier, whether it's in the individual level, like you and your family, or we're talking about our country, that you can say, I didn't do it perfectly. I might not have known better, but when I look back, I really wish I had done something different because that might have hurt you, or that might have confused you, or that might have alienated you, or that might have made you feel badly about yourself. And I'm sorry. I'm not perfect, and I'm willing to own that. What a role model for your children. What a role model for the world if we could see that in heads of government and, in our legislature. If people actually sat down and listened and said, oh, I misunderstood you, or I really disagree with you, but I'm not going to call you names. I'm going to try to work it out with you.
It's all about sitting down and listening to the other person and having conversations with them instead of shouting matches or protests where you want to burn and destroy. I understand the anger is there, but you've got to take the anger into something that's kind of healthy.
And that's exactly what the best therapy does. It helps people restrain themselves from their worst reactive impulses, come to the table, and actually listen. And I always say it this way because it seems so obvious, but we forget, all of us do, that we're helping people listen to each other the way we want to be heard. Nobody wants to be shouted at. Nobody wants to be called names or put down or walked out on. We don't. So we have to give that to each other if we want it for ourselves. And, it sounds so simple. And when you're really reactive and you're really hurt and you're really angry or you're really frightened, it's the hardest thing to do. And that's why I say peace takes courage. Relationship is the hardest work of all for human beings. Peaceful, nonviolent human relations are the hardest work of all for human beings and the most courageous. It takes so much inner strength. And it's worth it. That's why we do it.
But I don't understand. Why is it that we're so quick to judge everybody, but we're not quick to judge ourselves and realize that we're at fault for some of the things that are happening in society?
Yeah, I think some of it is, there's probably many reasons. I think, our egos actually aren't that strong. I think unless you can actually embody and embrace and own your own blind spots or your own missteps, that you actually have, or we actually have kind of a frail ego that is easily bruised. And so we don't want anyone to point out our flaws because we can't just say, you're right. I was really impatient with you and that wasn't very nice, or I was really angry at you and I never even bothered to find out what was happening for you. So you have to sort of build a strong ego structure or an inner world to be able to tolerate the distress of hearing things about yourself that aren't so great. And I think it's the same for our country as it is for us. We've hurt lots of people as a country. What if we could just own it and be proud of the fact that we could own it and want to make amends rather than defend against it and shield that fragile ego that's underneath, whether it's individual or collective?
You are so right. I mean, we need to own it. I love the way you said own it, and you said it several times, because we do need to own our own stuff. We're so quick to push our stuff onto somebody else and see the flaws in other people. Maybe that flaw that's being really magnified in another person is a flaw that is in us as well.
Well, of course. I mean, of course, because we're all human and we're all fallible and we all make mistakes and we all have blind spots and we all have strengths. And the whole purpose, we all have gifts, we all have something to offer. The whole purpose of owning and being responsible and being able to make amends and healing our own wounds is that we can be the best possible version of ourselves, and we can actually try to create a world where that's true for our neighbor. We're not competing. It's like, I want you to win. And that's one of the things that I learned as a therapist. Like, you want your clients to get better. I want you to win. I want you to walk out of here having a happier life than you came in with. And that's an attitude we can all bring to each other. You don't have to be a therapist or study psychology to do that.
That is so true. Now, going back to your book, America in Therapy, is it out now?
It is not out yet. So, and I will definitely let you know as soon as it's available. Okay. I wish it was out now, but it's not out yet.
Do you have any idea when it will be out?
I'm hoping within the next year. So yeah, the publishing process is a slow process. So I can't really say. But I really, my deepest desire is that it would come out before the next election. But we'll see.
Definitely need it out before the next election.
Yeah.
So let's take you through the process of writing the book. How long did it take? Now we're in the publishing step. So how long did it take you to actually sit down and write the book? And where did the idea come from for the book?
Well, the idea came, as I said, right out of my own experience. I just had this aha that what I was seeing in my office, I'm seeing in the world. And I just wanted to make that common knowledge because I feel like it's desperately needed. We need to know what's happening to us and we need to know what we can do about it. I actually started the book, an initial set of ideas for the book probably over 20 years ago. And then I forgot about it and I just didn't do it. I didn't forget about it, but I just didn't do it. And then maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I actually started writing the book in earnest. And I wrote a lot. I wrote, probably 2 books worth. And what I ended up with was just sort of a set of essays that were each distinct chapters, but I didn't have the thread that joined them all together. And so I looked for someone to work with at that point. And believe it or not, I found an amazing person, and I'll say her name. So for any of your listeners who are looking for someone to help them write their book, her name is Ashley Mansour, and Mansour, and she is fabulous. And so she was sort of like an editor, mentor for me to write the book. And believe it or not, I rewrote the whole thing from the beginning to the end.
Wow.
and I did it. I did with her coaching and her direction and her knowledge of how to put a book together and how to put my ideas together. The ideas were there, although I would say it really evolved in that process to something that it wasn't to begin with that I'm very happy with. I did it in 6 months maybe. I rewrote the entire book in something like 6 months, and then I revised it, and I revised it in 5 weeks. And that was the hardest 5 weeks of my entire life.
I can imagine.
In terms of writing, right?
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So our time is almost up. Before we talk about where people can find you, do you have one last little nugget that you want to share with everybody?
Yeah. What I want to say is that so many people feel hopeless, or they just feel like there's nothing I can do. It's just going to be what it is, and let's hope for the best. And what I want to say is, we each have a contribution, whether it's just up-leveling the way we relate to our friends and neighbors and family, or whether we're involved in some huge international project or somewhere in between. We all have a contribution that we can make to the tipping point for humanity. And I just want to give people the most love and support to do your piece. Even if you don't see results, do whatever is yours to do, because we're all needed here. and it's not going to change without all of us. So, I see my part and the things that I say in the book I'm writing as one grain of sand in a big beach. And we all make up that shoreline, and we can all change it.
What a great visual right there. One grain of sand in the beach. I love that. That's such a great visual.
Thank you.
So where can people find you at?
Yeah, they can find me on my website, www.phyllislevitt.com, and it's Leavitt. Some people spell it differently. And I'm on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, and I have a YouTube channel with a lot of podcast interviews on it. Whatever the other main social media are, I think I'm on. And if you go to my website and you'd like to follow me, just leave your email address and I will put you on the list for my newsletter, and I'll let you know as soon as my book comes out.
Yeah, and I cannot wait to read this book. I mean, I hope that when your book does come out that I'm on the list to review it for you, because I would love to review it, because
I would love that.
This book sounds amazing. It sounds like it's written in such a way that it's going to touch a lot of people's hearts.
Well, thank you, because that's really what I want the book to do. And if you don't mind, I will put you on my email list.
Go right ahead. I would love that.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. You've just been a fantastic host.
Thank you for coming on. You stole my part. That was my next line. Is like, thank you for coming on, and you already thanked me. So, So guys, I will put in the show notes everywhere where you can find Phyllis, as well as Phyllis has also written 2 other books as well. I'll put those in the show notes just in case you want to check out the way she writes. I'm sure the books is kind of a little bit different, is it not? The 2 books that you wrote before.
Yeah, the 2 books that I wrote before are more autobiographical and more really about my spiritual journey, which is sort of behind the scenes of what I'm talking about now. This book is very, very different, but they're not related. I mean, they're not unrelated just in the sense the content is unrelated, but they're not unrelated in the sense that I think that as we grow and evolve, I see that taking us to a place of greater love, greater compassion, greater relatedness, and greater sense of humanity and our interconnectedness with each other, whether we're talking about the spiritual path or psychology and our personal growth. So it's all one thing. Just different stories. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Phyllis, for coming on.
Thank you.
I cannot wait to read your book, like I said.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
So guys, we will see and hear you listen to the next Chats from the Blog Cabin. Hope you have a blessed day. Bye.
Bye.